Hey guys, good morning. Give us a minute and we'll start with a webinar. Uh, just waiting for a few more audience to join and we'll kickstart. Great. I think it's 9 a.m. Pacific time. Let's get started with a webinar. Again, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on hybrid cloud apps. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the folks joining from different parts of the globe. My name is Noor Basha, a marketing director at Winwire Technologies, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. So today's topic for the session is building hybrid cloud applications with Azure and Azure Stack. So in the next 30 minutes, we will basically learn how Azure and Azure Stack delivers a true hybrid consistency across applications, data, security, whether it be on-prem or on cloud environments. So before we get started, let me highlight a few housekeeping items. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end. And we are recording this session. We'll be sharing the presentation as well as the recording in next 24 to 48 hours. So with that, let me introduce you to today's session speaker, Mr. Viplav Sharma. So he's a technical architect at Winwire Technologies and brings over 14 years of experience in the IT industry. So he's basically involved in designing and architecting Azure-based solutions for our customers. He's also a Microsoft partner technical specialist, helping Microsoft technical sales team as a part of the Microsoft Managed Partner Program. So with that, let me hand it over to Viplav to take the session from here. Viplav, over to you.
Thank you, Noor. Hello, and everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks, Noor, for the introduction. You did my bit a little bit, so I will not repeat that. And my name is, as you can see on the screen, Viplav Sharma. I'm a technical architect with Winwire Technologies. Have been doing my bit with Azure for the last more than 3 years now. So pretty excited about Azure platform in general, and today this is what we're going to cover. We will this session, just to set the expectations. We are just a 30-minute session, so it is pretty high level. I would say 30,000 feet or maybe more, just to give you an idea of what hybrid cloud is and what all various Azure platforms you would use in order to build a hybrid cloud environment. One of them being Azure Stack, Microsoft's private cloud, and then we'll touch upon what tools you can use to migrate data from on-premise to cloud, and very importantly, the whole topic of securing the communication of data between on-premise and cloud using hybrid identity. Uh, we'll also touch upon the CI/CD part, which is very exciting for the developers, particularly, and how things are in relation to the hybrid cloud. At the end, we'll leave the line open for a couple of minutes if you have any questions. And as Noor said, you don't have to wait till that time. You can keep pouring in your questions. All right, so let's get started. Well, we all have seen the cloud computing evolve over the last decade or even more, I would say. And what we all are more used to, at least from my perspective, is public cloud. So this is Azure, where you subscribe, get a subscription, and you get various sorts of benefits, and there's a long list of that. But in a nutshell, it is pretty cost effective for you. You're not maintaining your infrastructure. Microsoft is doing it for you. They are maintaining it. They are, upgrading, patching all the time. All you need to worry about is your applications, right? And then, of course, given a situation, you may want to scale up the hardware or whatever storage and compute that you may want to scale up and down. So there's lots of benefits a public cloud gives you, and that's the reason why so many organizations are like already on cloud. But there are certain set of organizations, especially the large organizations and the government organizations, which not very comfortable going to the public cloud. Reason being, the infrastructure is pretty much shared between various tenants, and you can't really have your own policies applied on that when it comes to security. Uh, Compliance is a big thing for certain organizations, which is a big challenge in public cloud. And the fact that you have your resources not close to your organization, in certain cases, latency plays a big role as well. And that's where Microsoft, and just like any other cloud provider, came up with the private cloud of theirs, which is Azure Stack. And this takes care of the cons of public cloud. So what you do is you have your infrastructure on your organization itself, not in Microsoft, and then either you manage it or some service provider manages it, and you take care of all security. You define the rules, and everything is as per your configuration. Performance, as you can imagine, the whole infrastructure is at your place, so it works pretty well. But then it is just like cons to pros, it is mutually exclusive when it comes to the other way around as well. So you end up spending a lot of money on your capex, and then you have a huge risk of underutilizing your infrastructure and so on and so forth. And that's where this term hybrid cloud has been so popular for the last some time. And that's what we are going to cover in this session, how hybrid cloud brings the best of both worlds together. Uh, just going a little next level, hybrid cloud. So just as the name suggests, it is basically combining two or more clouds. And when I say clouds, it could be private cloud, public cloud, on-premises infrastructure. You have this environment which integrates all these various clouds and ensures a smooth and seamless communication of data between the various applications and its components in those clouds. It also secures it pretty much, like you can see in this diagram, that on the left you have Azure Stack, which is private cloud, and public cloud on the right, and you have a VPN tunnel through which all the communication is happening. And then at the same time, there is Azure Active Directory that is taking care of your authentication, authorization in a consistent fashion. So as we proceed in the further slides, I would be drilling down on these diagrams, and we'll talk about that. Um, First up, Azure Stack. I'm not sure how many of you have already familiarized with it, but this is, as I said, Microsoft's private cloud platform. Essentially, it's an extension of Azure, which allows you, or when I say you, allows the organization to deliver Azure services from their infrastructure, right? Um, so essentially, it is the same Azure services you would be having compute, virtual machines, network, and even a storage and SQL Server. Everything is same, but just that it is hosted on your data center. It could be company's data center or service provider's data center, but the point is, it's same set of infrastructure, not in Microsoft's data center, but on your data center. And that's what it does. And as you could see, the previous slide that I showed, it is pretty much a drill down of that. On the left, you have similar components which you have in the right. So nothing changes as far as the services are concerned. You have the same virtual machines and everything else, and you have a VPN tunnel which is allowing the seamless data exchange. So, and when you go to Microsoft's documentation, you would see these two terms very often. So there are two types of roles when you talk about Azure Stack. One is the operator. Well, that's the organization who is hosting the infrastructure, or the service provider who is managing the infrastructure for the on-premise organization. They configure the whole setup. They spend, well, setting up Azure Stack is a big thing in itself. Initially, when you think about the whole capacity planning and various resource planning. How are you going to deliver the services? What kind of quotas are you talking about, etc. Today, for public cloud, Microsoft does that for you, right? So in this case, it is not Microsoft, but you. And every time I say you in this session, it's the organization who is planning to set up Azure Stack on their infrastructure. So that's the operator, right? And then there are users, just like we consume Azure services by going to their Azure subscription, creating a new virtual machine, etc. Here, similar, but then you are going to an Azure Stack portal and getting them, consume them, whatever the operator has to offer, right? For the operator, the operator will be building these services and deploying them to Azure Stack. And there are two options what they can choose from. And the first one is pretty much an evaluation option. So you get a Azure Stack development kit and you work on your one single machine where you just test it out to see how it works for you. Once you are good with that, you get to the production mode, which is the integrated systems, where you would be deploying your virtual machines and other stuff to various different nodes in a cluster kind of environment. And how you do that, you go with the various hardware partners authorized by Microsoft. So you would work with them not only to purchase the hardware, but sometimes you may want them to manage your hardware as well. So as you can see, these are all popular big names. Nothing that I need to talk about, but this is what you would. These are the folks you would work with when you start setting up the Azure Stack environment. And service delivery model, we have been accustomed to how it works in a public cloud, Azure, which is, you have a subscription, you have resource groups, and various other things. Similar to that, I would say, but then there are certain differences. The operator, Azure Stack operator, works as I said, it works with a lot of planning has to be done. And once that is done, they bundle the services in groups of plans, and those plans are bundled in offers. So as a consumer, as a user, when I go to Azure Stack portal of an organization, I would get certain offers to pick from. So there are all packages. So slightly different, I would say, but this is the hierarchy that Azure Stack service model would follow. One thing which is really, really important for not only the operators, but as well as the users, is to be very clear on what are the differences between Azure and Azure Stack, apart from just being public versus private. But there are certain differences, right? So as I said, it will not be Microsoft who will be managing it. It will be either organization or their service provider. So every time there's a problem, you would be first contacting the service provider and not really Microsoft. Services, well, that's because Azure Stack is not fully blown into a finished product, I would say. So it still has certain services which are not available. So that has to be kept in mind when you start thinking about your various applications and all. The other thing which is important is that now that you have the services hosted on your data center, there is only one region, right? So you don't have the luxury that you have in Azure to go around and have a service in West Europe and anywhere else you want. So that's another very important factor you need to decide. Apart from the URLs and all, of course, you have a different portal and etc. One other thing which is very, very detailed in Azure Stack documentation, I didn't want to include it here because that would have taken 15 minutes, is that for every resource type, primarily the compute and the networking and the storage, there are limitations. And you may not get the latest versions that you would get in public cloud. And for the developers, it is also important because even the API versions and the PowerShell versions are slightly, I won't say outdated, but they're not really the latest and the greatest that you can get otherwise, right? So things have to be kept in mind. So let's move on to the next part. And this is data migration is one of the biggest pain points that we keep hearing and we keep going through when we try to migrate from on-premise to cloud. As we know, thinking of SQL Server and Azure SQL Database, there are so many different things which are not compatible, and it's not so easy to migrate because of those differences. So Microsoft has come up with this managed instance, which is the full name is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. In short, managed instance is basically a new deployment model of Azure SQL Database, right? Uh, what it does is it's an amazing thing because it not only keeps the past features of Azure SQL Database, but then it also takes care of the issues of compatibility and security that Azure SQL Database has, right? So as you can see, these 4 points kind of are the selling points, right? It allows a very smooth migration from on-premise to cloud, and that's one big factor for it. And they say it's near 100% compatibility to SQL Server. That doesn't mean it is 100%, but what they're saying is Microsoft's roadmap says that in future, maybe in a year's time, you will actually end up being 100%. And we will actually cover these points in the subsequent slide, but for now I'll talk about this here. This diagram, as you can see on the Microsoft documentation as well, this is how it explains the communication from and to managed instance. So it has its own virtual network, which it's kind of what do you say, encapsulates the managed instance and the on-premise database environment. So all the migration happens very securely. Also, Microsoft is managing this managed instance in this case, not you. So that's an added benefit, right? And that's the past benefit you get. And managed instance can also communicate with various other Microsoft services as well. As we can notice in this diagram, anything that is happening, whether it is data or management from and to managed instance, is secured using TLS and certificates. So that takes care of a lot of, it gives a lot of comfort to organizations that, security is taken care of. So as I started in the previous slide, there are past benefits, and I don't need to really talk about them. We all are aware of, you have scalability, you have availability, automatic backup and restore, and patches and whatnot. And at the same time, you have an isolated environment, as we saw in the previous slide, where you have a virtual network. Nobody else is really entering that network, just the managed instance and your premise environment. It also allows Azure AD authentication and single sign-on, which is great. And of course, the auditing on the SQL is another feature that's pretty useful. One thing which we are not drilling down in this session is very important is the data migration service. This is a tool that you can use to migrate your data from premise to cloud. So whoever is curious should actually check it out. It's pretty cool. Just like Azure Stack, managed instance has its own limitations, right? And again, the same thing. These limitations will be overcome in the future as per Microsoft. So you have certain limitations on the compute and memory and various different attributes of the database. And this is not just applicable to instance, but also to the region. Certain regions do not have, either they do not have that level of resource configuration, or they are not even available. So my managed instance is not available in all the regions today. And that's a typical thing with Microsoft. Anything that new comes up, it is gradually rolled out. So that's nothing surprising. We talked about the virtual network and all, but then there are two environments now, and you have a cloud, you have a on-premise, and you don't want to have two different identities for those. And that's where hybrid identity comes into picture. So Azure Active Directory has a component called Azure AD Connect. What it does is it integrates the identity, creates one user identity for the user to sign into both the environments. And I think this is not something new. Most of the organizations today have the users logging in with same credentials for your Outlook and Skype for Business, even Azure Portal and other SaaS applications that may have, or even the on-premise apps, right? So that's the whole concept that is already in play, and that itself is a hybrid computing concept. So there are three models using which you can set up the Azure AD Connect. Uh, the first one being password hash synchronization, where we know that on-premise Active Directory doesn't really store the credentials in plain text. It hashes into a hashed form, like a one-way algorithm. And what Azure AD Connect does is it synchronizes the identity of each of the users that you have, and I think it does every 2 minutes. So it synchronizes with Azure Active Directory, and the interesting part is while it does that synchronization, it it rehashes the hash password. So there are like 10 different steps that it takes before it synchronizes the password with Azure AD. It does a lot of manipulations on it, and that way the password is super secure. So that is like gives the comfort to the organizations. So at the end of it, the user will be using the same password to log in, whether he's on premise or on the cloud. The next authentication method is pass-through authentication. This is for the organizations who are not, even with such a great rehashing mechanism, if they are not comfortable to have Azure AD do the job for them, do the authentication for them. So in this case, even though the synchronization happens, the way it is done is the authentication is always done at the on-premise Active Directory. So whenever the user logs in, the whole authentication process goes through an agent, which is on premises, and then it exchanges the tokens and sends it back to the user. We have ADFS. I think this is a pretty, I would say, old concept. Different organizations having federation trust. In this case, Azure Active Directory and on-premise creating a federation trust, and the users, whether internal or external, logging in using that proxy. Right. So I don't need to expand on it. The last topic, rather last section, is the CI/CD. Now, you have your applications in the hybrid environment. You would be deploying certain things to cloud, certain things to premises. So you don't want to manage two different kind of DevOps pipelines to manage that, right? So that's where Azure DevOps allows you to actually do that in one integrated fashion. As you can see, the user, or rather the developer, will trigger a build, and then it goes through CI, continuous integration, and then continuous deployment. And in the pipeline, you can very well define the destinations, whether it goes to Stack or Azure. And that's as simple as that. There's nothing complicated there. So there are certain steps which you would take to set up the Azure Stack DevOps. So first of all, you will have to kind of set up the agent, right? So for Azure DevOps to kind of deploy anything to the Azure Stack, you will have to go through the typical steps that you do, creating a service principal, and then access keys, and then giving the rights to the Azure DevOps to the whole process that is typically taken care of when you are doing a DevOps pipeline, right? You build an agent, create personal access tokens, and then you install the build agent, and then that agent runs the builds on a periodical basis, as you would do. Now, in order for Azure DevOps to actually to succeed in deploying to Azure Stack needs to create an endpoint, right? DevOps needs to know where to deploy. So that's something you will do. There is certain steps involved in that, and then the rest is the usual. You develop your build, you create your release, and then keep going with that. I'll quickly cover this as we are nearing the closing time. so here there are benefits, right? If you really see, as I said earlier, you can define the destinations for whether it is cloud or premises. And the interesting thing is you can change them at any point of time, right? So today you may have an application on premises, and tomorrow you may decide to deploy it to cloud. It's just a configuration. And then the other thing is it also helps your development team because you are using the same set of tools whether you are developing for cloud or premises application, right? That really helps. There's no real like learning curve. Anybody can work on any kind of application. And I would say the most important benefit that it gives is the number five, where it whatever you build for Azure today, the same thing can be deployed to Azure Stack without changing a code. And that's extremely amazing, right? So as I said, if you take decisions saying, oh, we are migrating to cloud, it will take 1 year to migrate, so we will gradually move our applications. There's no problem with that. You can keep deploying to on-premises, and within 6 months, 1 year, you can move them to cloud. So that's really good. Um, this thing I would quickly cover here is Microsoft has this marketing term which says Azure Hybrid Benefit. This is like the selling pitch from there. So if you're trying to make a decision whether or not you should go with Microsoft Azure slash Azure Stack platform, it's very important to know that AWS is 5 times more expensive than Azure for your Windows Server and SQL Server, which in itself is a big statement, right? So other important aspect to understand is we talked about data migration, and when you're migrating data, you actually can reuse your on-premises licenses of SQL Server, so you don't really need to have the licenses repurchased. Same thing goes with the Windows Server data center. You can actually get that reused as well. There is a whole benefit that you can get, and of course you keep getting security updates all the time. So there are quite a few benefits, and this is really the last slide. So Noor, allow me in a minute. Basically, what we're saying is we started off this session saying, private cloud and public cloud has their own benefits, and then they have their disadvantages. But now hybrid cloud is not only allowing you to have full control of infrastructure, it's allowing you to apply security on that, and at the same time, it is giving you the flexibility, the scalability, and all that. And most importantly, it's allowing you to move your data to cloud in a very, very smooth fashion. Not just for the It's not just the benefit for the executive folks from a cost perspective, but also for the developers and the people involved in building those systems. So that's the reason I think this is the way to go. It's still maturing, I would say. We will have the limitations taken care of in the coming days. With that, Noor, I'm done.
Thanks, Viplav. Thanks for the quick session. I really appreciate that. I know we have 2 more minutes, but I have a few questions coming in. I think the first question from Mark is, how is the pricing model of Azure Stack different from Microsoft Azure?
Well, I would say the details would be there on their site, but what I know is uh, when you talk about pricing, you need to take into account these two bullets here as well, right? You are going to reuse your licenses in certain aspects, so that actually helps. But if you really say if you're not doing that, and if you're getting new virtual machines or anything like that, uh, I think the pricing is still similar, like pay per use or something like that. So I believe there is not a lot of difference between that, but I would recommend visiting the pricing page of Azure Stack.
Thanks. That's right, Viplav. I think that's certainly a good point. I think Microsoft would have all the information on the pricing on their website. I think you would get the real information from there. So the second question from Mike is, can you talk a little bit on how data can be migrated from on-premises to Azure using managed instances?
Right, and I think I would have loved to have a couple of more slides there. It's just that didn't have the time, and as I said, it was 30,000 feet for right now. We may have session hence like in future drilling down on that. But to answer your question, in short, well, data migration, even though I said that it's a very smooth on lift and shift, but it will still involve a lot of steps, right? And you still have to assess the data that you have on your premises. There are tools that we are used to, data migration assistant is one of them. You will go through that. Even though managed instance is near 100% compatibility, you still have to find out what is that uh, little bit of non-compatibility that we need to be aware of. And then once you do that, in this case, you will be setting up the virtual network that managed instance has natively available, but then you would have to take care of that. And once that is done, then your data migration service comes into play, and there are some you can get it going. But only difference between what we are doing today versus, I shouldn't say today, but what we are used to versus what managed instances has to offer, that it's much smoother than what we are used to. So there are certain steps that will still remain. You can't just click a button and migrate it. So that's not going to happen.
Thanks, Viplav. I know we are 1 minute over. If you could just quickly move to the next slide, I would just like to highlight on the next webinar. I know I have few more questions, but I would like to take them offline, respecting everybody's time. Again, I would like to thank everyone for joining this webinar, and I hope you find it useful and informative. Just to highlight, our next webinar on next month, which is on Feb 21st, is on building microservices with Azure, where we will be talking real use cases about microservices, some of the scenarios, and how you can really build a real world application with core.NET and Dockers. So stay tuned. Again, thanks Viplav, and thanks everyone for joining this session. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys. Thank you.